Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a really fascinating piece from the School of Thought's blog, written by an author known as the Queen of Africa. The piece is called We Must Be Our Own Storytellers, and we're going to explore a pretty massive, fundamental truth about human nature, how the stories we tell literally shape our reality. We're looking at how leaving out crucial context can subjugate people, while complete, unvarnished truths have this incredible power to restore human dignity. It's a super powerful read, so let's just jump right in. Okay, so we're starting with this incredibly deliberate, profound thought from the acclaimed author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She establishes right out of the gate that stories, well, they aren't just passive entertainment. They're actually these highly active, incredibly potent tools that hold the absolute power of self-worth. When we think about the narratives we consume every day, we really underestimate their capacity to either completely strip someone of their humanity or beautifully give it right back to them. And that idea right there, that sets the whole foundation for what we're talking about today. Section 1, the power of storytelling. So, to really understand the mechanics behind this power, we have to recognize that stories are hands down one of the most effective tools for influencing an entire culture. They communicate a population's shared values, their history, the whole shebang. But what happens when those stories are deliberately skewed? Our source brings in some really eye-opening perspective from Rudine Sims Bishop and her work on African American children's literature. Bishop points out that back in the 19th and 20th centuries, a vast amount of literature literally reduced Black characters to jokes. It made them seem inherently less than everyone else. And our source highlights a completely crucial realization here. These stories, with their demeaning portrayals, were likely never ever meant for Black children. They were designed for a totally different audience, setting up this quietly damaging cultural baseline from a very, very young age. Moving right along to Section 2, a childhood illusion. Now, to move from the abstract idea of storytelling to the tangible, very real human impact, we're going to look at a highly specific, super emotional story from the childhood of the acclaimed actress Viola Davis. This is detailed in her memoir, Finding Me, and it all starts at the bubbla, which, by the way, is just the Rhode Island term for a water fountain. Davis vividly remembers the overt racism she faced right at this everyday, mundane object. Her classmates would literally wait for the teacher to look away before whispering horrific racial slurs, telling young Viola that she was dirty, and outright refusing to drink after her. I mean, it is just heartbreaking to consider the visceral, daily toll that takes on a kid who's just trying to get through the school day. And this perfectly illustrates a really tragic dynamic. Day in and day out, these classmates are cruelly bullying young Viola. Finally, pushed to her absolute limit, she retaliates. She goes after a girl named Maria, trying to rip her yellow dress, because Maria had been using those racial slurs with zero consequences. But what happens next is what really stings. The teacher punishes Viola, saying there was absolutely no explanation for her behavior and completely ignores the root cause of the bullying. But here's the kicker. As our source points out, Viola still idealized this young and pretty teacher. She even volunteered to stay after school and clean the chalkboard for her. Why? Because a desperate child seeking validation and kindness from an authority figure is going to create a phantom illusion of a caring teacher, just to survive the sheer hostility of her environment. Let's trace the escalating tension Viola felt on one specific day to see how this carefully constructed illusion was completely, utterly shattered. It starts in the morning with that daily hostility at the bubbler. Then we move to the afternoon, where a classroom activity drops an entirely new layer of trauma, leading ultimately to a quiet, totally devastating confrontation after class. Right in the middle of that day, the class was watching an American history film strip. When images of Black people in slave quarters popped up, the voiceover delivered this crushing line. Black people, or slaves at this time, were illiterate. That means they couldn't read or write. According to her memoir, the classmates immediately started laughing. They turned to Viola and whispered cruelly that her people couldn't do anything. I mean, just imagine sitting in that room. The very story being told by the educational material wasn't just inaccurate, it was actively giving ammunition to her bullies. Which brings us to Section 3, the missing historical context. So, despite being labeled a quote-unquote troublemaker and being absolutely terrified, young Viola stayed quietly after school. She cleaned that entire chalkboard, just biding her time, gathering up the immense courage to ask her teacher about that horrific claim from the film strip. Put yourself in the shoes of a child hearing these stories. She asks, "Miss, it's not true, is it? Black people could read and write? They could, couldn't they?" She is desperately asking a trusted adult for reassurance, right? Pleading for her dignity to be restored by the very person in charge of her education. But the teacher simply shook her head sadly and said, "No. I'm sorry, honey, they couldn't." Viola left with her head down, her spirit completely crushed. Okay, so the absolutely crucial point here is the devastating gap between a half-truth and reality. Yes, the teacher confirmed the illiteracy, but the immense cruelty lies in her historical omission. She completely failed to explain the missing reality, that reading was explicitly legally forbidden during slavery. She left out the vital context that would have protected a young girl's pride. By failing to explain that this enforced illiteracy was a calculated, deliberate method used to keep enslaved people subjugated, the teacher fed Viola a highly destructive half-truth. The narrative wasn't just incomplete, it was a weaponized omission. It made it seem like illiteracy was an inherent flaw of the people themselves, rather than what it actually was, a brutal, systemic tool of oppression inflicted upon them. Section 4. Owning our own narratives. Now, zooming way out from Viola Davis's childhood to the macro implications here, our source reflects on how these exact same educational systems are still failing youngsters today. The author of the blog notes that even as an African studying history, the topic of slavery was barely brushed upon, leaving these massive gaps in understanding. Teachers hold immense, incredible power as authoritative figures. When they present only one side of historical stories, when they gloss over realities, and feed youngsters these damaging half-truths, they make children feel worthless and ashamed of who they are. Instead of fulfilling their fundamental duty to uplift and empower the students sitting in their classrooms, they actively let them down. And this leaves us with a profound, lingering question about the real psychological impact of our educational systems. Our source asks it directly: how many other youngsters were fed these half-truths? How many have been made to feel completely worthless and stripped of their dignity by historical omission? Because the impact of a half-told story, it certainly doesn't end when the school bell rings, right? It shapes a person's entire sense of self-worth for a lifetime. To wrap up this explainer, we're looking to a quote referenced by our source from an interview with Eva Longoria: "Never about us, without us." It is such an empowering rallying cry. It reminds us that true dignity, the exact kind Chimamanda Ngozi she spoke about at the very beginning of our journey today, can only be restored when communities have the absolute agency to tell their own historical and cultural truths from their own perspectives. It challenges all of us, every single one of us, to ask, who is telling the story? What context is being conveniently left out, and how can we ensure we are the authors of our own narratives? So as you go out and consume stories today, what narratives are you accepting as whole truths, and whose context might be missing from the picture? Think about that. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you next time.